Have you ever held down the power button on your phone, tapped power off, watched the screen go black, and assumed the phone was completely dead? Most people do. But here's the strange part. On modern smartphones, the device usually isn't truly off at all. Even when the display is black and the phone looks inactive, tiny parts of the system can still remain powered in the background. Certain chips continue listening for button presses, alarms, charging signals, or emergency features. In other words, the power button on your smartphone is usually not a true hardware kill switch, and that raises an interesting question. Why don't smartphones have a real physical off switch like older electronics used to? Why can't we completely disconnect the battery instantly with a button? The answer involves convenience, engineering, security, battery design, and surprisingly, the way modern phones are built almost like miniature computers that never fully sleep. So let's break it all down, right here, on History of Simple Things. Older electronics use genuine hardware switches. On devices like radios, cassette players, and early desktop computers, pressing the power button physically interrupted the electrical circuit. No electricity flowed. The machine was truly dead until you switched it back on. Early mobile phones worked more similarly to this idea. Many removable battery phones from the 1990s and early 2000s could be fully disconnected from power simply by removing the battery. Some even had more direct hardware-style switches. But smartphones changed everything. When devices like the iPhone and early Android phones evolved into pocket-sized computers, they needed more advanced startup systems, storage protection, wireless communication, and background management. Suddenly, simply cutting power became risky. Modern phones now use soft power systems controlled partly by software and partly by specialized hardware controllers. What actually happens when you turn off your phone? When you tap power off, your phone doesn't instantly disconnect electricity from the battery. Instead, the operating system begins a shutdown sequence. Apps close, files finish writing, wireless connections stop. The processor enters a low-power state. Then most major components power down, but tiny subsystems can still remain awake. For example, many phones still detect charging cables even while off. Some alarms can still trigger. Certain chips stay ready to detect the power button press needed to boot the device again. This low-level management is usually handled by something called a Power Management Integrated Circuit, or PMIC. Think of it like a traffic controller for electricity inside the phone. If the battery were physically disconnected instantly every time you press the button, it could interrupt file writes and potentially corrupt data. Modern operating systems are far more complicated than the software found on older flip phones. So, why don't companies add a real kill switch? One reason is design. Modern smartphones are packed incredibly tight. Manufacturers prioritize water resistance, thinness, durability, and battery space. Adding a dedicated mechanical cutoff switch would require extra internal hardware and moving parts. And moving parts are often weak points. A true hardware disconnect could also interfere with features people now expect like Find My Phone, scheduled alarms, quick boot up, NFC payment systems, or emergency location services. Some phones even appear off while still allowing very small background functions to operate. For example, certain newer phones can still support limited tracking features for a while after shutdown. Another issue is batteries themselves. Today's smartphones use lithium-ion batteries, which rely on sophisticated charging and protection systems. Abruptly disconnecting components improperly could create stability or safety problems. Engineers carefully manage how power flows throughout the device. So instead of a hard cutoff switch, manufacturers use controlled shutdown systems. This is where things get a little controversial online. Some people believe phones are fully active even after shutdown, secretly recording everything. In reality, there's no solid evidence that properly powered-down mainstream smartphones continue functioning normally in secret. However, security researchers have shown that certain low-level chips can remain minimally active for specific purposes. These are usually tiny background systems designed for startup detection, wireless locating features, or hardware management. That's very different from your entire phone secretly running apps while off. Still, from a technical perspective, your phone often isn't electrically dead unless the battery is fully drained or physically disconnected. And since most modern phones don't have removable batteries anymore, users have lost the easiest way to guarantee a total shutdown. So, could phones have real hardware off switches again? Technically, yes. A company could absolutely design a smartphone with a genuine hardware disconnect switch. In fact, some privacy-focused devices already include physical kill switches for microphones, cameras, or wireless radios. But for mainstream smartphones, manufacturers prioritize convenience and sleek design over absolute hardware disconnection. Most users want phones that turn on instantly, stay connected, support tracking features, and maintain system reliability. A true physical cutoff switch would add complexity that most consumers may never use. Ironically, the closest thing to a real off switch today is simply letting the battery die completely. So the next time you hold down the power button on your smartphone, remember, you're usually not cutting the electricity completely. You're asking an incredibly tiny computer to shut itself down gracefully. Modern phones are designed less like old-school electronics and more like always-ready systems that constantly balance power, connectivity, and convenience. That's why the old-fashioned hardware off switch quietly disappeared. Your phone may look completely asleep, but deep inside, a few tiny parts are often still awake, waiting for the moment you press that power button again. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.